My name is Audrey Sutton, and I was 18 years old when my parents canceled my graduation party because my brother had a meltdown over a ruined trip. I wish I could say that was the moment I realized something was deeply wrong with my family, but the truth is, I had known it for years. That night just made it impossible to keep pretending anymore. I had spent months looking forward to that party. Not because I needed some huge spotlight or a perfect social media moment, but because graduating with honors actually meant something to me. I had worked for it. I had earned it. For once, I thought I was allowed to have one evening that didn't revolve around Brandon's moods, Brandon's plans, or Brandon's latest crisis. The night before the party, a line of Midwest storms rolled through and canceled his flight to New York. He had been planning to go for an internship interview and had been bragging about it for weeks, like it was already the first step to owning Manhattan. When he found out the trip was off, he completely lost it. He slammed a cabinet door so hard it shook the kitchen wall, then snapped, "If I can't have my weekend, she doesn't get hers either." What still gets me is not even what he said. It's how quickly my parents accepted it. No one told him to grow up. No one reminded him that my graduation had nothing to do with his bad luck. They just did what they always did when Brandon was upset. They rearranged the whole house around him and expected me to understand. The next day, I was still outside helping set up folding chairs in the backyard, straightening tablecloths, and carrying trays for a party that had already been taken away from me. I just didn't know it yet. And by the time I finally found out the truth that night, my entire life was about to change. Have you ever realized the people who should have celebrated you were the same ones quietly teaching you that your happiness came last? By 7 that night, the backyard looked almost too perfect, which somehow made it worse. The lights were glowing along the fence, the trays were covered and waiting on the patio table, and every few minutes I checked my phone, thinking someone would text to say they were running late. At first, I told myself people were delayed because of traffic, or because graduation weekends were always chaotic, or because maybe my aunt from Milwaukee had gotten stuck on the road. But as the sky darkened and the yard stayed empty, a sick feeling started to settle in my stomach. I went back inside and found my mother in the kitchen pretending to wipe down a counter that was already clean. My father was at the island staring at his phone like he suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. I asked the question 3 different ways before anyone gave me a real answer. Where is everybody? Did something happen? Why is no one here? My mother finally let out this long, exhausted sigh and said, "We canceled it." Just like that. No apology, no softness, nothing. I honestly thought I had heard her wrong. I asked who she meant by we, and my father stepped in with that calm, patronizing voice he always used when he wanted me to feel childish for having feelings. He said Brandon had already been upset enough about his canceled trip, and they didn't think it was right to have a party while he was in that state. Then he added that maybe we could do something smaller another time, like what had been taken from me was a dinner reservation instead of the one night I had worked toward for months. Something in me cracked wide open. I asked them if they were seriously telling me they canceled my graduation party because my 21-year-old brother threw a tantrum. My mother crossed her arms and said I was being dramatic. She said Brandon had lost an important opportunity and I should have a little empathy. That word almost made me laugh. Empathy. I had spent my whole life being told to have empathy for Brandon. When he failed a class, I was told not to mention my grades. When he took over the living room every night, I was told he needed space. When he ruined holidays with his attitude, I was told not to provoke him. When he got into trouble, everyone rushed to explain how much pressure he was under. But when I needed one thing, one single night that was supposed to belong to me, suddenly I was selfish for not stepping aside. I told them I was done pretending this was normal. I told them I was tired of getting his leftovers, tired of being the child who always had to understand, tired of acting grateful for scraps while they built their whole world around Brandon's moods. My father's face hardened the second I said it out loud. He told me to lower my voice. My mother said I was turning this into something bigger than it was. Then Brandon came downstairs with that same smug, irritated look he always wore when he knew they would protect him no matter what. He leaned against the bottom stair and said, "You should really stop acting like everything is about you." I turned and stared at him, because I honestly could not believe he had the nerve to say that in a house where every plan, every holiday, every decision had revolved around him for as long as I could remember. I asked him if he had any idea what it felt like to watch your own parents erase the one day that was supposed to celebrate you just because he couldn't handle hearing someone else be happy. He rolled his eyes and said, "Life wasn't fair." Like, that was wisdom, and not just the excuse he used every time things didn't go his way. My mother immediately stepped in to calm him down. Not me, him. My father kept looking at me like I was the one ruining the evening. And right when I realized no one in that room was ever going to admit how wrong this was, the front doorbell rang. The whole house went still. My father frowned. My mother looked confused. Brandon straightened up from the stairs, and for the first time all night, every person in that house looked nervous. My father was the one who opened the door, and the second he did, the entire mood in the house changed. Walter Sutton stepped inside with the kind of quiet presence that made people straighten up without even realizing it. He was holding a gift bag in one hand and wearing the same calm expression he always wore. But the moment he looked past my father and saw my face, he knew something was wrong. He glanced toward the backyard through the kitchen windows, probably expecting to see cars parked along the street and people gathered under the lights, but the yard was empty. The food was untouched. The chairs were still lined up in perfect rows like props on a stage, after the audience never arrived. He asked very simply, "Why is no one here?" No one answered him right away. My mother forced a smile that didn't even come close to reaching her eyes and said there had been a change of plans. My father tried to brush it off by saying the party had been postponed because it just didn't feel like the right night to celebrate. Walter looked from one face to the next, then back at me, and I think he could tell from the way I was standing there that this was not some harmless scheduling issue. He asked me directly what happened, and that was it. That was the moment everything I had been swallowing for years finally came out. I told him they had canceled my graduation party because Brandon's trip to New York got canceled, and he threw a fit over it. I told him they had called and texted all the guests without even telling me, then let me spend the whole day setting up for a party they already knew was never going to happen. I told him this was not really about one night either. It was about every holiday that got hijacked by Brandon's moods, every achievement of mine that had to be softened so he would not feel bad, every time I was expected to be the mature one while he was allowed to be selfish, loud, and impossible. The room went completely silent while I spoke. For once, nobody interrupted me. Nobody told me I was overreacting. Nobody told me to lower my voice. Walter just listened, and the longer he listened, the harder his expression became. When I finished, he turned to my parents and asked if any part of what I had said was untrue. My father started in with excuses immediately. He said Brandon had been under a lot of pressure. My mother said the weather had already ruined the weekend and they were trying to keep the peace. Brandon muttered that everyone was making him sound like a villain over one bad day. Walter did not raise his voice, which somehow made what he said next hit even harder. He said he had spent the last 3 years helping my parents keep their real estate office afloat after a series of failed deals nearly buried them. He said he had sent money quietly, month after month, because he believed he was protecting a family that loved each other and knew how to stand on its own feet. He even said a large part of the money used for this graduation party had come from him, because he wanted me to have a night that reflected how hard I had worked. I stared at him because I had never known any of that. My parents had always acted like every sacrifice in the house came out of their own pockets. Suddenly, 100 little things made sense. the whispered phone calls, the tension whenever bills came up, the way my mother kept insisting they were just in a tight season. Walter looked straight at them and said, "The money stopped now." Effective immediately. My mother went pale so fast it was almost shocking. My father stepped forward and told him he was being extreme. Brandon started talking over everyone, saying this had nothing to do with business and that I was manipulating the situation. Walter shut all of it down with one look. He said this had everything to do with character, and that he would not keep funding people who could look their daughter in the face, erase one of the biggest days of her life, and still expect to be seen as the victims. My mother's eyes filled with tears then, but even in that moment she looked more terrified about losing his support than ashamed of what she had done to me. My father kept trying to frame the whole thing as a misunderstanding, but it was too late for that. The truth was standing in the middle of the kitchen, and nobody could shove it back into the dark. Then Walter turned toward me, and his voice changed completely. It softened in a way that almost undid me on the spot. He asked, "Audrey, do you want to come home with me tonight?" For a second, I could not even breathe. I looked around that kitchen at the people who should have fought for me long before it came to this. My mother was still pleading with Walter. My father was already talking numbers and consequences. Brandon looked furious but not guilty. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that almost felt cold. If I stayed in that house, nothing would ever change. So I looked at my grandfather and said yes. No one asked me to stay. That was the part I remember most clearly. Not my mother crying, not my father trying to talk Walter out of cutting them off, not even the stunned silence that had settled over the kitchen like everyone had finally walked into a truth they could not talk their way around. It was the fact that when my grandfather asked if I wanted to leave with him, and I said yes, nobody turned to me and said, "Audrey, wait." Nobody said, "Please do not go." Nobody said, "We were wrong." My father kept talking about the business like that was the real emergency. My mother kept saying this had all spiraled too far, but even then she was looking at Walter, not at me. Brandon just stood there with his jaw tight, angry in that familiar way he got whenever the world stopped rearranging itself around him. I went upstairs without another word because suddenly I understood that if I opened my mouth again, I might say something I had been holding in for 18 years, and I did not want my last moment in that house to sound like begging people to care. My room looked exactly the same as it had that morning, which somehow made everything hurt more. The dress I had planned to wear for the party was still hanging on my closet door. My graduation cards were stacked on my desk beside the little decorations I had bought with babysitting money because I wanted the night to feel special. For a second, I just stood there, staring at all of it, trying to understand how a day that was supposed to mark the beginning of my life had turned into the night I walked away from my family. Then I grabbed my suitcase from the closet and started packing. I took clothes, my laptop, chargers, the folder with all my college paperwork, my yearbook, a framed photo of me and Walter from when I was little, and the jewelry box my grandmother had left me before she died. I left behind the dress. I left behind the decorations. I left behind every single thing that felt tied to a version of home that had never really existed. While I packed, I could still hear voices downstairs, low and urgent. My parents trying to negotiate with Walter like this was a contract dispute, and not the moment their daughter had decided she could not live there anymore. That told me everything I needed to know. By the time I zipped the suitcase closed, I was not crying anymore. I felt strangely calm, like some part of me had finally gone numb after being bruised for too long. When I came back downstairs, nobody moved toward me. My mother looked at my suitcase, then at my face, like she had not truly believed I would go through with it. My father started to say my name, but there was no apology behind it, only frustration and disbelief. Brandon looked away before I even reached the bottom step. I did not stop in the kitchen. I did not hug anyone. I did not explain myself. Walter took the suitcase from my hand, opened the front door, and I walked out of that house without saying goodbye. The air outside was cooler than I expected, and the street was so quiet it almost felt unreal after everything that had just happened inside. When we pulled out of the driveway, I looked back once and saw the lights from the backyard still glowing over the empty chairs and untouched tables, like the ghost of a celebration that had been canceled before I ever had a chance to be part of it. That image stayed with me the whole drive to Naperville. It felt like the perfect picture of my place in that family. Everything could look finished from the outside while something important was missing at the center. Walter did not push me to talk on the drive. He just let the silence sit until it became something gentle instead of heavy. After a while, he told me I did not have to explain anything to him, and hearing that almost broke me more than all the yelling had. By the time we reached his house, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He brought my suitcase inside, showed me the guest room he had already started thinking of as mine, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. It was such a simple sentence, but it landed in me harder than anything else that night because it sounded like safety. For the first time in years, I was in a house where I did not have to earn the right to take up space. And somewhere between setting my suitcase down and sitting on the edge of that bed, I realized I had not just left without a word. I had left behind the role they had written for me my entire life. The first few days at Walter's house felt strangely quiet, and that quiet messed with me more than I expected. I had spent so many years living around Brandon's moods that peace almost felt suspicious at first. Nobody slammed doors. Nobody acted like the whole house had to brace itself because one person was in a bad mood. Nobody expected me to smile through disappointment and call it maturity. Walter gave me space without making me feel abandoned, which was something I had never realized a person could do. He showed me where he kept extra towels, cleared out dresser drawers for me, and asked whether I wanted tea or coffee in the morning like my preferences actually mattered. It sounds small, but when you grow up being treated like the flexible one, the child who can adjust to anything, being asked what you want feels almost overwhelming. My phone started buzzing early the next morning and barely stopped after that. At first, it was my mother sending long messages about how emotions had been high and how nobody had meant for things to go this far. Then my father texted to say I had embarrassed the family by leaving so dramatically, but that he was willing to move forward if I would stop making everything harder. Even then, he still wrote like I was the one who had broken something. Brandon never reached out directly, which honestly told me more than any apology could have. He did not think he had done anything wrong. He probably still believed I would cool off and come back once everybody settled down. What really made my stomach turn was how quickly the messages shifted toward Walter. My mother asked whether I had spoken to him yet. My father wanted to know if he had really meant what he said about the money. Then came the careful guilt, the kind that sounds soft until you listen closely. They said the business was already under pressure. They said employees depended on them. They said I knew how much stress the whole family had been under lately. In other words, they still were not talking about me. They were talking about access, damage control, and whether I could be useful. I sat on the edge of the bed reading those messages and felt something harden inside me. For years, I had confused being needed with being loved, but those are not the same thing. Walter never told me what to say. He just reminded me that I did not owe anyone a rushed forgiveness just because they were finally uncomfortable. That night, I sent one message to both of my parents. I told them I was safe. I told them I was not coming back, just because they suddenly felt consequences. And I told them very clearly that if they wanted any relationship with me in the future, it would only happen after real change, not empty apologies, and certainly not because they wanted Walter's support restored. Then I put my phone face down and let the silence do its work. A couple of days later, Walter sat down with me at the kitchen table and asked what I wanted my future to look like now that no one else was choosing it for me. That question stayed with me. We started going through my college plans seriously, not as some distant dream, but as something real and possible. He helped me compare financial aid packages, look at housing costs, and think beyond survival for the first time. On Saturday, we made barbecue in the backyard, and while he checked the grill, he told me stories about failing in business when he was younger and how pride can ruin people faster than bad luck ever will. It was the kind of conversation my father always claimed he would have with me someday, except Walter was actually having it. Little by little, I stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like I had landed somewhere solid. I started sleeping through the night. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. I even caught myself laughing one afternoon when Walter made a dry comment about how some people mistake volume for character. It felt unfamiliar, but good. For the first time in a long time, I was not bracing for the next disappointment. I was beginning to understand what life felt like when your peace was not always one person's bad mood away from being destroyed. And that was exactly when Brandon decided to show up and remind me that people like him do not give up control easily. 2 weeks after I moved in with Walter, I was walking across the school parking lot after meeting with a guidance counselor when I saw Brandon leaning against my car like he belonged there. For a second, I honestly thought I might turn around and go back inside, because just seeing him standing there brought back that same tight feeling I used to get at home. Like peace could disappear the second he decided he wanted attention. He straightened up when he saw me and gave me that irritated half laugh he always used when he wanted to act like I was the unreasonable one. He said, "So this is what we're doing now? Running to Grandpa and blowing up the whole family because you didn't get one party?" I stopped a few feet away and looked at him long enough to make it clear I was not going to be pulled into his version of the story. Then I took my phone out, unlocked it, and started recording without hiding it. His face changed immediately. He asked me if I was serious, and I said I was completely serious. I told him he could say whatever he came there to say, but if he raised his voice, threatened me, or tried to follow me, I would go straight to the police and then send the recording to every relative who still believed my parents' version of events. He looked stunned for a second, probably because I had never talked to him that way before. Brandon was used to people backing down. He was used to being the loudest person in the room and mistaking that for power. But I was done being the soft place he landed every time life disappointed him. He said I was acting insane. He said I had destroyed everything over something small. He said our parents were barely holding things together and Walter cutting them off had put everyone under pressure they did not deserve. Then he looked right at me and said, "You always hated that they cared more about me. This is just you finally getting revenge." But that was the moment I understood he really believed that. In his mind, I was not someone who had been hurt. I was someone who had stepped out of line. I told him if he wanted the truth, here it was. I said the problem was never that our parents loved him. The problem was that they built the whole family around, protecting him from consequences while expecting me to absorb every disappointment in silence. I said they did not cancel my graduation party because of weather or timing or stress. They canceled it because a grown man threw a tantrum and they decided his bad mood mattered more than their daughter. He tried to interrupt me, but I kept going. I told him that if hearing the truth felt like an attack, maybe that was because he had spent too many years being rewarded for selfishness. That landed. I saw it in his face. He stepped closer and lowered his voice, which somehow felt more hostile than if he had yelled. He said I was making a mistake, and that once Walter got tired of playing hero, I would have nowhere to go. I lifted my phone a little higher and said, very calmly, "Take one more step toward me and I'll make sure this recording is the least of your problems." He stopped. We stood there for a few seconds in the middle of that parking lot, and for the first time in my life, Brandon looked unsure of himself around me. He muttered something under his breath, called me selfish one more time, and walked off like he was the injured party. I waited until he drove away before I got into my car, and once I did, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, letting the adrenaline burn itself out. I was shaking, but not because I felt weak. I was shaking because I had finally defended myself without apologizing for it. That night, my parents sent what turned out to be their final message. It was a long text, cold and polished in the worst possible way. My father wrote that they had decided to move forward as a family without me, if that was what I wanted. My mother said they were done begging me to come to my senses. They said an investor from my mother's side of the family had stepped in to help the business, so Walter's support was no longer necessary. Then came the part that should have hurt, but somehow did not. They said I was jealous, divisive, and too immature to understand what real family loyalty looked like. They said I had chosen bitterness over love. At the very end, my father wrote that it would be best if there was no further contact for a while. I read the whole thing once, then read it again, just to make sure I was really seeing it clearly. And what I felt, more than anything, was relief. Not because it did not matter, but because it finally confirmed what I had been trying not to admit for years. They were never going to give me the truth, the apology, or the place in that family I had spent my whole life trying to earn. So before they could decide that silence was their punishment, I blocked all three of them: my mother, my father, Brandon. Then I set my phone down and went downstairs, where Walter was in the kitchen making coffee for the next morning like it was any ordinary night. He looked at my face once and seemed to understand that something had ended. I did not give him every detail right away. I just told him I was done. He nodded like that was enough, and for the first time since my graduation night, I felt something inside me settle. Because that was the moment I stopped waiting for my family to become people they had never once shown me they were willing to be. By the time summer turned into fall, my life barely resembled the one I had been living that night in my parents' kitchen, and for once, that was a good thing. I accepted my spot at the University of Illinois and moved forward with a kind of peace I had never really felt before. Walter helped cover what my scholarship did not, but he never made it feel like charity. He treated it like an investment in someone who had worked hard and deserved to be taken seriously. That alone changed something in me. I was no longer waiting for permission to believe in my own future. I was building one. I chose marketing because I liked the strategy of it, the psychology behind what people value, what they ignore, and what they only appreciate once it is gone. Maybe that choice said more about my life than I wanted to admit. Somewhere in the middle of all that change, I got closer to Cole Bennett, a guy from school who had always been steady in a way that felt rare to me. He was kind without making a show of it, funny without needing to be the loudest person in the room, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be around someone who did not confuse care with control. He never pushed me to talk before I was ready, but when I did, he listened like my words mattered. That meant more than I can explain. Back at my parents' house, things did not collapse overnight in some dramatic movie-style disaster. It was slower than that, and honestly, more satisfying because it was real. The investor from my mother's side kept the business from going under immediately, but it did not replace what Walter had been quietly stabilizing for years. A few deals fell through. A couple of agents left. Their office downsized. The kind of people who had always loved being around my parents when things looked polished and successful started keeping their distance once the image cracked. Before the year was over, they sold the house and moved into a smaller townhome farther from the neighborhood they had worked so hard to impress. I heard bits and pieces through relatives who still spoke to Walter, and none of it surprised me. Families like mine can hide dysfunction for a long time, as long as money keeps smoothing over the damage. Once that cushion disappears, character starts to show. Brandon had his own version of that reckoning. The internship trip that mattered so much never got rescheduled, and without the same automatic support and constant excuses from everyone around him, he had to do something he had avoided his whole life. He had to adjust. He ended up taking part-time work at a sporting goods store while figuring out what to do next. And I know that does not sound cruel or dramatic, but that is exactly why it felt right. His punishment was not some huge public humiliation. It was being forced to live like an ordinary person after spending years acting like everyone else's life should bend around his feelings. That was the first real consequence he had probably ever faced. As for me, I stopped measuring my healing by whether they regretted what they did. That was one of the hardest lessons, because part of me used to think closure meant hearing my parents finally admit I had been right. But closure is not always an apology. Sometimes it is distance. Sometimes it is peace. Sometimes it is waking up in a home where no one resents you for having needs, going to class without a knot in your stomach, laughing at dinner without wondering whose mood is about to ruin the night. The longer I stayed with Walter, the more I understood that family is not defined by who shares your last name or who raised you under their roof. Family is the person who notices your silence and does not use it against you. It is the person who makes room for you without asking what they get in return. It is the person who does not ask you to shrink so someone else can feel bigger. Looking back now, I do not think the worst thing my parents ever did was cancel my graduation party. The worst thing they did was teach me for years that love had to be earned by being easy, useful, and endlessly understanding. Leaving showed me that real love does not work like that. Real love does not punish you for shining. It does not disappear the moment you stop sacrificing yourself. If anything good came from that night, it was this. I finally learned that walking away from people who keep hurting you is not cruelty. It is self-respect. Blood can tie you to people, but it cannot force them to value you. And it does not obligate you to stay where you are only tolerated when you are quiet. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave without a word and let your absence say everything they refused to hear when you were still there. And if you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, I hope you chose yourself, because losing the wrong people can be the first step toward finding the right life. Our team at Revenge Argon is working hard to create meaningful, engaging stories that connect with viewers on a deeper level. We want to make it clear that this is a fictional story, created to share helpful lessons, positive values, and educational messages with our audience. One of the strongest educational values in this story is the importance of self-respect and healthy boundaries. It reminds viewers that real love should never require constant sacrifice without care or fairness in return. The story also offers a meaningful lesson about personal growth, showing that sometimes walking away from toxic treatment is the first step toward healing and building a better future.